Constable Pettigrew, a man of methodical temperament and limited imagination, had already begun taking statements before Inspector Graves arrived from the county town some 40 minutes later. By that time, the autumn darkness had settled completely over St. Mary Mead, and the porch at Thornfield Manor had been cordoned off with that rather amateur-looking rope that small-town police forces always seem to employ on such occasions. The body had been carefully covered with a white sheet, though the candle remained burning beside it, now serving as evidence rather than decoration. The inspector, a lean man in his mid-50s with the shrewd eyes of someone who had seen enough human nature to develop a permanent skepticism about everyone's stated motives, surveyed the scene with the expression of someone who had expected this job to be simpler than it was proving to be. Within minutes, it became apparent that this was not going to be a straightforward matter of a burglar interrupted mid-theft or a domestic dispute escalated beyond reason. James Courtney's pockets contained nearly £300 in notes, his expensive wristwatch remained on his arm, and his wallet sat in his jacket pocket containing credit cards and documents that suggested he had been a man of considerable means. Whatever had happened on that porch, simple robbery could be immediately eliminated as a motive. The preliminary examination suggested that Courtney had been struck with considerable force on the side of the head, likely with something blunt that had not been recovered at the scene. The wound suggested a weapon of some weight, perhaps something that could be easily concealed and carried away. Death, the doctor estimated, had occurred between 4 and 5 o'clock in the afternoon, which placed the murder during that peculiar window when the village was neither fully occupied nor entirely empty. A time when people might be anywhere or nowhere, engaged in private activities that left no witnesses. Richard Ashford's account of his nephew's movements became the central point of investigation, though his obvious distress seemed to blind Constable Pettigrew to any deeper questioning. Ashford claimed that James had indeed stepped outside for air around 4 o'clock, mentioning he wished to walk the grounds and perhaps visit the small lake that lay beyond the eastern gardens. Ashford had remained in his study, he insisted, and had not heard anything unusual. The servants, what few remained in the house at that hour, confirmed seeing James depart through the side door but had observed nothing further. Miss Marple, who had remained at the edge of the investigation with the quiet persistence of a woman accustomed to being overlooked, noticed that Constable Pettigrew had not asked a single question about the candle beyond its obvious presence. This struck her as rather curious, for objects deliberately placed in such conspicuous positions rarely arrived there through accident or coincidence. They were statements, whether the person placing them intended them as such or not. A silver candle holder of evident quality, positioned precisely on that particular porch where it would be noticed by anyone passing in the gathering darkness. It suggested purpose, knowledge, perhaps even a message. But when she gently inquired of the constable whether he had ascertained who the holder belonged to, he waved away the question with the vague reassurance that such details would be sorted in due course. There were, after all, far more pressing matters to attend to, and the silver holder appeared to be nothing more than a piece from Ashford's own collection. It was around 8 o'clock, as the crowd of villagers had begun to disperse reluctantly back to their cottages and homes, that Inspector Graves made an observation that seemed to sharpen the investigation's focus considerably. He had interviewed Richard Ashford at length and had noted certain inconsistencies in the older man's account. Nothing dramatic enough to constitute a direct contradiction, but rather small variations in timing and detail that suggested the strain of uncertainty, or perhaps deliberate obfuscation. Graves was particularly interested in learning more about James Courtney's financial situation and his relationship with his uncle. Money, he had learned across decades of investigation, was usually at the root of such matters. A nephew could be an heir, and heirs had been known to arrive at their inheritance through considerably more direct routes than the slow passage of time and the natural progression of death. When Graves suggested that further questioning would be necessary, and that it would be helpful to establish a clearer picture of the victim's circumstances and relationships, Miss Marple quietly approached him with an almost apologetic demeanor. She had known the Ashford family for many years, she explained in that gentle, rambling manner she adopted when sharing village knowledge. Richard's wife had passed nearly a decade ago, and the estate had been somewhat troublesome to maintain. There had been certain financial difficulties, rumors of mortgages and complications with the property taxes. James, she understood, had been living rather expensively in London, and there had been some question about whether his uncle's resources might have been stretched in his direction. But more interesting, perhaps, was the matter of the housekeeper who had left Thornfield's employ just 3 weeks prior under rather sudden and unexplained circumstances. Her name was Eleanor Hartley, a capable woman in her late 40s who had served the household faithfully for nearly 15 years. She had given notice quite abruptly, citing family matters that required her immediate attention, though Eleanor had no family in the area, nor had she been seen in the village since her departure. The inspector, noting the thoughtful expression in Miss Marple's eyes, found himself wondering whether this elderly woman had observed something that everyone else had missed, whether she was simply engaging in the harmless speculation that passed for entertainment in rural communities. Inspector Graves had learned long ago that village gossip, though often laden with personal bias and speculation, frequently contained kernels of observable fact that proved invaluable to investigation. Miss Marple's mention of Eleanor Hartley thus became the focus of his next inquiry, and by the following morning, with the efficiency of police work that moved faster when personal connections were involved, he had located the woman at a small boarding house in the neighboring town of Ashbourne, some 8 miles distant from St. Mary Mead. Eleanor proved to be a woman of composed demeanor but evident nervous tension, the sort of person who answered questions precisely, but offered nothing beyond what was directly asked. She confirmed that she had indeed left her position at Thornfield Manor abruptly, citing family responsibilities, though when pressed about the nature of these responsibilities, she became evasive and uncomfortable. She had not yet heard about James Courtney's death, a fact that Inspector Graves found himself carefully observing. Some people, upon learning of a murder in a place they have recently left, display various emotional reactions: shock, relief, curiosity, but Eleanor Hartley's response was something closer to resignation, as though she had been expecting bad news but had hoped it might not arrive in this particular form. What emerged during that interview, conducted in the austere sitting room of the boarding house while other residents moved quietly through the corridors, was a picture of a household considerably more complicated than Richard Ashford's public persona suggested. Eleanor had witnessed increasing tension between uncle and nephew during the preceding months. James, it appeared, had arrived at Thornfield Manor not merely for a pleasant visit, but with specific intentions regarding his uncle's financial affairs. The young man had been pressing Richard about his will, about the disposition of the estate, about investments and assets that seemed to constitute the entirety of the older man's diminishing fortune. Eleanor had overheard conversations. She was careful to emphasize that she had not deliberately eavesdropped, but had simply been present in the house performing her duties, in which James had become increasingly aggressive, even threatening, suggesting that Richard's management of family resources had been irresponsible and that legal action might be necessary to protect what remained of the Courtney interests. The situation had escalated 3 weeks prior when James had arrived with a solicitor's letter, the contents of which had left Richard visibly shaken. Eleanor, who had brought tea to the study that afternoon, had witnessed her employer's face drain of color as he read the correspondence. She had heard him say, quite distinctly, that James was attempting to take control of matters that were not his to control, that the boy was behaving like a vulture circling a dying animal, and that if James did not cease his machinations, he would be removed from the property entirely and cut off without a penny. It was this final statement, Eleanor explained to Inspector Graves with the careful precision of someone recounting events of significant consequence, that had prompted her to leave. She could not abide household conflict of such magnitude, could not endure the atmosphere of resentment and barely contained anger that had begun to permeate Thornfield's rooms. She had given notice and departed, intending never to return. When Graves inquired as to whether she had any knowledge of Eleanor's current employment or future plans, the woman hesitated for just a fraction too long before indicating that she had secured a position as housekeeper to a family in Scotland and was awaiting their confirmation. The timing seemed somewhat convenient, though Graves possessed no evidence to suggest her departure was connected to James Courtney's death, beyond the general principle that people with guilty knowledge often remove themselves from proximity to potential accusation. Yet Eleanor Hartley seemed too controlled, too deliberate in her responses, to be engaged in crude deception. She appeared rather to be a woman protecting something, whether herself or another party remained unclear. By the time Inspector Graves returned to St. Mary Mead with this information, the village had entered that peculiar state of agitated speculation that followed upon violent death. The discovery that James Courtney and his uncle had been engaged in serious financial dispute substantially altered the prevailing narrative. Where previously the crime had seemed senseless, now it began to fit into recognizable patterns of greed and desperation. Surely the villagers reasoned over their morning tea and afternoon conversations. This was clear evidence of Richard Ashford's guilt. The old man had killed his nephew in a fit of financial desperation, had placed the candle as some sort of ritualistic marker, or, more likely, as a confused attempt to stage the scene as something it was not. The motive was clear, the opportunity was established, and the suspect was conveniently present at the location. Within hours, a general consensus had emerged among St. Mary Mead's residents that the case was effectively solved, requiring only the formality of arrest and trial to confirm what everyone already knew. Miss Marple, who had resumed her knitting in her window seat and received a steady stream of visitors eager to share their theories and observations, listened with her characteristic patience to each account, each interpretation, each confident assertion of Richard Ashford's culpability. She asked gentle questions about matters that seemed peripheral to the case itself, about Eleanor Hartley's family situation, about the timeline of the earlier conversations that had caused such distress, about the precise moment when James had decided to leave London and arrive at Thornfield Manor. She inquired, with apparent irrelevance, about the habits and movements of various villagers on the afternoon in question, about what people had been doing in that crucial window between 4 and 5 o'clock when death had come to the estate. Her needles continued their steady clicking, and her blue eyes remained focused on her work, yet nothing that was said escaped her notice or failed to be carefully filed away in that remarkable mind that had spent 70 years observing human nature in all its complexity and contradiction. The arrest of Richard Ashford came on the morning of the 3rd day following James Courtney's death, executed with a certain theatrical gravity that seemed designed to satisfy the village's appetite for conclusive action. Inspector Graves, armed with what he considered sufficient circumstantial evidence, the clear motive rooted in financial dispute, the opportunity afforded by proximity and timing, and Richard's somewhat evasive responses to detailed questioning, had obtained a warrant and arrived at Thornfield Manor with Constable Pettigrew in attendance. Richard received the news with a composure that struck several observers as either the mark of an innocent man too stunned to fully comprehend the accusation, or the mark of a guilty man who had prepared himself for this eventuality. He dressed himself carefully, spoke with quiet dignity to the few servants remaining in the house, and submitted to the formal procedures of arrest without resistance or protest. By midday, he was established in a cell at the county jail, awaiting the preliminary hearing that would determine whether sufficient evidence existed to proceed to trial. The village, having obtained what it craved, the satisfaction of witnessing justice in motion, the resolution of uncertainty transformed into apparent clarity, began the process of returning to its ordinary rhythms. The murder was no longer a mystery, but a confirmed fact requiring only the legal machinery of courts and juries to finalize. Discussions shifted from speculation about the murderer's identity to more comfortable territory. The proper procedures for managing Thornfield Manor during the legal proceedings, the likely disposition of the estate, and the various minor scandals that might emerge once the house's secrets were more fully exposed to scrutiny. Life, it seemed, would return to its pleasant routine, disrupted only by the ongoing legal processes that would eventually consign Richard Ashford to whatever fate the courts deemed appropriate for his alleged crime. Yet Miss Marple found herself unable to achieve the same sense of resolution that seemed to have settled over the rest of St. Mary Mead. She sat in her usual chair, ostensibly engaged in completing the grey cardigan for the vicar, but her needles moved with less regularity than was customary, and her attention frequently drifted from her work to the window overlooking the lane. There was something about the arrangement of facts, the neat way in which motive and opportunity had aligned themselves to point toward Richard Ashford's guilt, that struck her as precisely too neat, too perfectly organized. In her long experience of village life, she had learned that genuine human crimes were rarely so obligingly structured. They were messy things, rooted in complicated emotions and contradictory desires, filled with small details that refused to cohere into patterns of perfect clarity. The fact that everyone could so readily understand Richard's supposed motive, that the case could be so easily explained to even the least perceptive observer, suggested to her acute mind that perhaps someone had rather deliberately constructed a narrative designed to achieve exactly this effect. It was this consideration that prompted her, on the afternoon following Richard's arrest, to undertake a small expedition to Thornfield Manor itself. She had telephoned ahead to indicate her intention to visit, presenting herself as a concerned elder of the village community wishing to express sympathy for the trying circumstances that had befallen the household. The temporary housekeeper who had been engaged to manage the estate's basic functions received her with the sort of respectful deference that greeted Miss Marple everywhere she traveled. The woman, Mrs. Henderson, was a widow from a neighboring village, brought in to maintain order during what everyone assumed would be a brief period before Richard's legal matters were settled. Miss Marple, expressing genuine sympathy for the disruption to the household's routines, asked if she might be shown the grounds, particularly the eastern portions where James had supposedly taken his final walk. The afternoon was cool and grey, with that particular quality of autumn light that rendered everything in muted tones and suggested the imminent arrival of winter. The gardens at Thornfield, once clearly well maintained, had begun to show signs of neglect consistent with Richard's acknowledged financial difficulties. As Miss Marple walked slowly along the paths, her eyes took in numerous details that most visitors would have overlooked, the wear patterns on the stone pathways suggesting the routes most frequently traveled, the particular places where undergrowth had been recently disturbed, the curious absence of any items on the porch itself that might suggest how James had spent his final moments outdoors. She walked to the small lake that Richard had mentioned in his account, a modest body of water, perhaps 2 acres in extent, surrounded by mature trees that had shed much of their foliage. The walking paths around the lake's perimeter showed evidence of recent use, though curiously, the wear seemed concentrated along one particular section rather than distributed evenly as one might expect if casual afternoon strolls had occurred. What caught Miss Marple's particular attention, however, was something far more mundane than these observations of general wear and pattern. On a stone bench near the lake's northern edge, partially concealed beneath fallen leaves, she discovered a man's cap, a rather expensive item of brown tweed, the sort of thing a fashionable young man from London might wear if he wished to present himself as country comfortable while maintaining a certain urban sophistication. She left it precisely where she had found it, making no mention of her discovery to Mrs. Henderson as they returned to the house. But as she took her leave of Thornfield Manor and made her way back towards St. Mary Mead, her mind was turning over the implications of that small object, considering what it might suggest about James Courtenay's activities during those final hours, and wondering whether Inspector Graves, focused as he was on the obvious motive and convenient suspect, had thought to examine such seemingly peripheral details with the care that thorough investigation demanded. By the evening of that same day, Miss Marple had made discreet inquiries through channels that had proven reliable over decades of village life. She learned through Mrs. Timmins at the post office, who maintained an almost encyclopedic knowledge of all incoming and outgoing correspondence, that James Courtenay had received several letters during his stay at Thornfield Manor, letters that had arrived in expensive envelopes bearing London postmarks and return addresses from law firms and financial institutions. More significantly, she discovered through the vicar's wife, who possessed an almost supernatural ability to gather information through the innocent medium of parish visiting, that James had made at least one telephone call to someone in London during the evening before his death. A call that had lasted nearly 30 minutes and had been conducted in low, urgent tones that suggested matters of considerable importance rather than casual social pleasantry. The vicar's wife, Mrs. Emerson, had overheard fragments of this conversation while delivering soup to the manor at Richard's request, and she recalled James saying something about assurances and final arrangements before catching sight of her and abruptly terminating the discussion. These details, while individually insignificant, began to construct in Miss Marple's mind a picture considerably more complex than the straightforward narrative of financial dispute that had satisfied Inspector Graves. She spent the following morning composing a letter to the inspector, written in her characteristic manner, careful, deferential, and couched in the sort of tentative language that made it clear she was merely offering observations from a simple village woman with no pretensions to expertise in such matters. She mentioned, quite casually, the discovery of the cap at the lake, noting that it seemed curious that it had not been mentioned in Richard Ashford's account of his nephew's afternoon movements. She inquired, with apparent innocence, whether the inspector had examined James's correspondence or made inquiries about his financial circumstances beyond the immediate family dynamics. She suggested, almost apologetically, that people traveling from London often carried considerably more complicated baggage, metaphorically speaking, than was immediately apparent to those who encountered them only briefly. Inspector Graves, a man of sufficient professionalism to recognize when a seemingly peripheral observation might conceal matters of genuine significance, treated Miss Marple's letter with more seriousness than he might have accorded similar communications from other village sources. He made inquiries, and what emerged was a picture of James Courtenay considerably at odds with the simple characterization of a nephew pressing his uncle for money. James had been involved in several business ventures in London, ventures that had attracted the attention of certain financial authorities concerned about the legitimacy of his operations. He had been, in short, a young man engaged in activities that occupied a decidedly murky territory between legitimate business and outright fraud. The letters he had received at Thornfield Manor proved to be from solicitors representing clients who believed themselves to have been defrauded by various schemes with which James had been associated. One letter in particular, dated 2 days before his death, contained language suggesting that legal action was being contemplated unless immediate restitution was made. This revelation altered the investigation's focus considerably. James Courtenay began to emerge not as a simple fortune hunter preying upon his elderly uncle, but as a man pursued by creditors and potentially criminal liability. A man who might have been seeking refuge at Thornfield Manor not merely to pressure Richard for money, but to escape complications arising from his London activities. When Inspector Graves shared these discoveries with Miss Marple during a visit she received from him at her cottage, a visit undertaken with somewhat less official formality than his earlier interviews, suggesting a growing respect for her perspicacity, she listened with particular attention to details about the financial arrangements James had been proposing. He had apparently suggested that Richard pledge Thornfield Manor as collateral for a substantial loan, a loan that would ostensibly be used to consolidate family resources, but that James would almost certainly have diverted to address his own pressing obligations. The implications of this arrangement began to suggest alternative interpretations of the crime. If Richard had discovered the true nature of his nephew's intentions, had realized that he was being manipulated not merely for inheritance-related disputes, but as a tool for James's escape from London complications. The emotional tenor of their conflict would have shifted dramatically. What had appeared to be simple greed might instead have been desperation born of moral bankruptcy. But what also emerged, as Inspector Graves continued his more thorough investigation, was evidence that Richard Ashford had apparently begun to comply with at least some of James's demands. A solicitor in the neighboring county had been contacted about the possibility of mortgaging the estate, and preliminary paperwork had been prepared, though never finalized. Miss Marple, reflecting on these developments as she sat in her window seat with her needlework, found herself returning repeatedly to the image of that cap on the stone bench and to the question of what James Courtenay had actually been doing during those final hours before death arrived on the porch. Had he been walking the grounds in contemplation of the life he had constructed? Or had he been meeting with someone, conducting some final negotiation or confrontation that evening had precipitated? The official narrative of Richard's guilt had seemed too tidy, and these new revelations about James's complicated circumstances suggested that the true story might contain layers considerably more intricate than anyone had yet acknowledged. She wondered, with the patient persistence that had characterized her investigations across decades, what detail everyone continued to overlook. What obvious fact remained stubbornly hidden in plain sight because no one had thought to examine it from precisely the correct angle. It was a conversation overheard quite by accident that provided Miss Marple with the insight she had been seeking, though the source of this revelation proved far more unexpected than she might have anticipated. She had been visiting the library in the village on a quiet Thursday afternoon, ostensibly to select a new novel for her reading pleasure, when she encountered Sarah Blackwood, the young woman who worked at the village tea shop and who had been among the crowd gathered at Thornfield Manor on the evening of the discovery. Sarah was in conversation with the librarian, Miss Pettigrew, and was expressing her distress about recent developments with a candor that suggested she did not realize Miss Marple was within earshot, partially obscured by the tall shelves of the reference section. Sarah had apparently encountered Eleanor Hartley, the former housekeeper, quite by chance in Ashbourne 3 days prior, and Eleanor had confided certain details about her departure from Thornfield Manor that she had not shared with Inspector Graves. According to what Eleanor had revealed to Sarah, the true reason for her sudden departure had not been the general household tension, but rather a specific incident that had occurred approximately a week before James Courtenay's arrival. Eleanor had witnessed an encounter between Richard Ashford and a woman who was decidedly not a member of the household staff or a casual visitor from the village. This woman had arrived at the manor late one evening when the household was presumed to be quiet and had been admitted through the side entrance by Richard himself rather than through the formal front door. Eleanor, fetching something from the kitchen pantry, had glimpsed the woman briefly as she passed through the corridor and had noted her expensive clothing and sophisticated appearance, the bearing of someone accustomed to commanding attention and respect. More significantly, Eleanor had overheard fragments of conversation between Richard and this mysterious visitor, conversation that had contained emotional intensity, suggesting far more than casual acquaintance, indeed suggesting a connection of considerable personal significance. When Eleanor had tentatively inquired of Richard the following morning about his visitor, he had dismissed the question curtly, indicating that the matter was entirely his own concern and that Eleanor's discretion regarding the visit would be appreciated. But Eleanor, possessing the natural curiosity that most long-term household servants develop, had made certain inquiries of her own and had eventually learned, through conversations with the village taxi driver who occasionally conveyed passengers to and from Thornfield Manor, that this woman had been driven not from Ashbourne or any of the neighboring villages, but from the railway station, suggesting she had arrived from London or points beyond. Moreover, the taxi driver had distinctly heard her address Richard as "my dear," a form of address suggesting intimacy rather than formal acquaintance. Miss Marple, absorbing this information with the careful attention of someone who recognized the significance of what was being revealed, found herself considering the implications with growing clarity. She did not interrupt Sarah and Miss Pettigrew's conversation, but rather waited until an appropriate moment to depart the library, her mind already beginning to reorganize the facts of the case according to this new information. A woman from London, visiting Richard Ashford in secret, arriving and departing under circumstances suggesting discretion and deliberate concealment. This opened entirely new avenues of investigation that the official inquiry had not yet explored. She returned to her cottage and spent the remainder of the afternoon in methodical thought, reconstructing the timeline of events, considering how this unknown visitor might factor into the circumstances surrounding James Courtney's death. By evening, she had made her decision. She composed a second letter to Inspector Graves, this one considerably more direct in its suggestions than her previous communication. She inquired whether the inspector had made inquiries into Richard Ashford's personal relationships, whether he had considered the possibility that Richard might have been engaged in matters of a romantic or emotional nature that could have influenced his behavior and state of mind. She suggested that the appearance of such a visitor during the period immediately preceding James's death might constitute more than mere coincidence. She inquired, with characteristic delicacy, whether the inspector had examined Richard's correspondence for personal letters as thoroughly as he had examined the business-related communications. She concluded by expressing her conviction, based on her long observation of human nature, that crimes were rarely the products of single motives or simple emotional states, and that the most apparently straightforward explanations often concealed more complex truths beneath their surface. Inspector Graves, receiving this letter the following morning, found himself growing increasingly impressed by Miss Marple's perspicacity and increasingly concerned that his initial investigation might have been pursued along an overly narrow path. He authorized new lines of inquiry, instructing his officers to make discreet inquiries regarding Richard Ashford's personal life and relationships, to examine his correspondence more thoroughly, and to investigate whether any woman matching Eleanor's description had been noted entering or leaving Thornfield Manor during the relevant period. Within 2 days, these inquiries had begun to bear fruit. A woman named Catherine Marlowe, a widow of some means residing in London, admitted under gentle questioning that she had indeed visited Thornfield Manor on the evening in question, and that she had been engaged in a relationship of considerable personal significance with Richard Ashford for the better part of 2 years. She was, moreover, considerably distressed to learn that James Courtney had been murdered, as she had been present at the manor on the very evening of his death, and had witnessed something that she had not thought to mention to anyone because she had not realized its potential significance. Catherine Marlowe proved to be a woman of approximately 55 years, intelligent and composed, with the refined bearing of someone accustomed to navigating the complexities of a sophisticated social world. She received Inspector Graves in her London residence with a candor that suggested she had been expecting this conversation and had prepared herself for the necessity of revelation. She confirmed that her relationship with Richard Ashford was indeed of a deeply personal nature, that they had been contemplating marriage, and that she had travelled to Thornfield Manor on the evening of James's death specifically to discuss certain matters pertaining to their future arrangements. She had arrived by taxi at approximately 3 o'clock in the afternoon, had been admitted through the side entrance to maintain discretion, a precaution she acknowledged as somewhat excessive in retrospect, and had spent the subsequent hours in conversation with Richard in his private study, discussing their plans and, more pressingly, the complications that James's arrival had introduced into Richard's circumstances. What Catherine then revealed constituted the turning point in the investigation's trajectory. She had been present in the house when James had departed for his walk around 4 o'clock, had observed him leave through the side door with an expression of evident agitation. Richard, she explained, had been deeply disturbed by James's increasing demands and manipulations, and had confided in her his growing conviction that his nephew intended to strip him of Thornfield Manor through the combination of legal pressure and emotional coercion. Richard had spoken, with uncharacteristic bitterness, of his intention to refuse James's demands categorically, to change his will entirely, and to make clear that any further attempts at financial manipulation would result in James's permanent estrangement from the family. Catherine had attempted to counsel moderation, to suggest that such drastic measures might be premature, but Richard had been resolute in his determination to assert control over his own affairs. They had been engaged in this discussion, with Richard pacing the study in considerable agitation, when they had heard what Catherine described as a commotion emanating from somewhere in the house. Sounds she could not precisely identify, but that had suggested some sort of disturbance or altercation occurring in one of the distant rooms. Richard had immediately departed the study to investigate the source of these sounds, leaving Catherine alone. She had waited for perhaps 15 minutes, becoming increasingly concerned at his prolonged absence, before venturing into the corridor to locate him. It was at this juncture that she had encountered something that had puzzled her considerably at the time and that she now realized might be of substantial significance. In the corridor leading toward the side entrance and the eastern portions of the house, she had seen a figure. A woman, she believed, though she could not observe the face clearly as the person was turned away from her, who appeared to be moving with considerable haste toward the rear door. The woman had been wearing what Catherine described as a dark coat and a brown hat, and had carried what appeared to be a walking stick or perhaps a club of some sort, though Catherine acknowledged that the latter identification was speculative. The figure had disappeared through the door before Catherine could address her or determine precisely who she was. Confused and concerned by these observations, Catherine had returned to the study where she had eventually encountered Richard emerging from the opposite direction, appearing deeply shaken and mentioning vaguely that he had been checking the grounds to investigate the disturbance she had heard. They had discussed whether to investigate further or to contact the local police, but Richard had seemed reluctant to involve authorities, expressing concern that such action would introduce complications and scandal into matters that he preferred to keep private. It was only later, when news of James's death had reached Catherine, that she had begun to comprehend the terrible implications of what she had witnessed. She had contemplated coming forward immediately, but had been paralyzed by uncertainty regarding what she had actually seen, by her concern for Richard's welfare and reputation, and by her own complicated position as an unmarried woman who had been present in Richard's house under circumstances that might be viewed with disapproval by village society. Inspector Graves, listening to this account, with growing comprehension of how profoundly the investigation's direction had been obscured by surface-level assumptions, made immediate inquiries into the identity of the unknown woman Catherine had glimpsed. Richard Ashford, when confronted with Catherine's testimony and with the specific description of the figure she had observed, became noticeably agitated and demanded that Catherine be questioned more thoroughly, insisting that her account was confused and potentially unreliable. But Catherine, maintaining her composure throughout the interrogation, stood firmly by her description and expressed her conviction that Richard had not been responsible for James's death, that whatever she had witnessed had involved a third party whose identity remained unknown to her. This development prompted Inspector Graves to widen his investigation considerably, to reconsider aspects of the case that had previously seemed settled, and to undertake inquiries into the movements and whereabouts of other individuals connected to Thornfield Manor during the critical time period. Miss Marple, upon learning of these new developments through the village grapevine, that peculiar network of communication through which information flowed with remarkable speed and surprising accuracy, found herself experiencing a curious sensation of recognition, as though pieces of a puzzle she had been examining were suddenly beginning to align themselves into patterns she had subconsciously perceived all along. The cap at the lake, the mysterious visitor, Eleanor's departure, James's complicated circumstances, and now this unknown woman glimpsed moving with evident urgency through Thornfield's corridors. All of these elements began to coalesce into a narrative considerably more intricate and far more human than the simple tale of financial dispute that had initially satisfied the village's appetite for explanation. She sat quietly with her needlework, her blue eyes reflecting an understanding that had arrived not through dramatic revelation, but through the patient accumulation of small observations, and she waited with characteristic patience for the investigation to pursue the logical conclusion toward which all these elements were now pointing. The identification of the mysterious woman proved to be considerably more complicated than Inspector Graves had anticipated, for Catherine Marlowe's description, while detailed in certain respects, lacked the specificity necessary to narrow the field of suspects with any great precision. A woman in a dark coat and brown hat could describe any number of individuals within a reasonable geographical radius of Thornfield Manor. The investigation thus proceeded along what might be characterized as a process of systematic elimination, with Inspector Graves' officers making inquiries among all women known to have had any connection whatsoever to Richard Ashford or James Courtenay during the relevant period. These inquiries eventually extended beyond the immediate circle of family and household staff to encompass a broader net of village acquaintances, village tradespeople, and individuals who might have had occasion to visit Thornfield Manor for reasons both professional and personal. It was during the course of these expanded inquiries that a curious pattern began to emerge, one that initially seemed tangential to the investigation but that gradually assumed increasing significance as additional details were uncovered. Several witnesses reported having observed Sarah Blackwood, the young woman from the village tea shop, on the afternoon of James's death, moving along the lanes in the direction of Thornfield Manor at approximately 4 o'clock in the afternoon. When questioned directly about her movements on that particular day, Sarah initially claimed to have been working at the tea shop throughout the afternoon, a statement that was contradicted by her employer, who acknowledged that Sarah had taken an unscheduled break of nearly an hour, citing a personal matter that required her immediate attention. Moreover, when pressed about the nature of this personal matter, Sarah became noticeably evasive and defensive, insisting that it was entirely private and bore no relevance to the investigation into James's death. These inconsistencies, while not constituting definitive proof of involvement in the crime, were sufficiently suggestive to warrant more detailed questioning. Inspector Graves, recognizing that Sarah's reluctance to provide straightforward answers suggested she was concealing something significant, arranged for her to be brought to the police station for formal interrogation. It was during this interview that Sarah's carefully constructed facade of composure began to crumble, and a considerably more complex story emerged. Sarah, it transpired, had been acquainted with James Courtenay prior to his arrival at Thornfield Manor, having met him during the previous spring when he had briefly visited the village and had patronized the tea shop on multiple occasions. An attraction had developed between them, an attraction that Sarah had believed to be mutual, and that had seemed, at the time, to hold promise of deepening into something more substantial. But James had subsequently returned to London without making any definitive commitment, and his communications with Sarah had become increasingly sporadic and evasive. When James had suddenly reappeared at Thornfield Manor, Sarah had been surprised and, initially, delighted. She had assumed his arrival might provide an opportunity to rekindle their connection and to clarify the ambiguous status of their relationship. However, her initial optimism had been significantly dampened when she had attempted to contact him at the manor and had been informed by the household staff that he was not available for social visits. More distressingly, she had eventually encountered James on the village lane and had attempted to arrange a meeting with him, only to have him respond with what she characterized as deliberate coldness and dismissal. He had made clear, with a cruelty that seemed designed to wound, that any relationship between them had been a mere passing amusement, that he had no interest in village girls or village entanglements, and that she should cease her attempts to contact him as they were becoming tiresome. James had then departed, leaving Sarah in a state of considerable emotional distress. What Sarah subsequently revealed was that she had resolved, in the hours following this humiliating encounter, to confront James and to demand an explanation for his callous behavior. She had taken her break from the tea shop specifically to walk to Thornfield Manor, armed with a walking stick she had carried for self-protection along the country lanes and with an intention to have a conversation with James that would force him to acknowledge her as a person deserving of respect rather than dismissal. She had encountered James near the lake, and they had engaged in what Sarah described as a heated argument, during which she had expressed her hurt and anger at his treatment of her. James, according to Sarah's account, had responded with continued mockery and cruelty, suggesting that she was deluded if she imagined herself capable of holding the attention of someone of his sophistication and worldly experience. He had been, she explained, remarkably brutal in his rejection, and had made comments so wounding and contemptuous that Sarah had lost her composure entirely and had struck him with the walking stick in a moment of overwhelming rage and despair. Sarah's account of the subsequent moments was confused and fragmentary. She had struck him repeatedly, she acknowledged, driven by an emotion so intense that it had temporarily transcended her conscious control. When she had finally regained her senses, James had been lying on the ground beside the lake, blood streaming from his head, and she had realized with a horror that had seemed almost unreal that she had seriously injured him. She had panicked, had attempted to ascertain whether he was still breathing, and had ultimately decided that her only course of action was to flee the scene. She had run back toward the village, had returned to the tea shop, and had attempted to resume her normal duties as though nothing of significance had occurred. She had been unaware, she maintained, that James had died until the news had reached the village the following day, at which point she had been too terrified to come forward, fearing that she would be accused of murder when she had only been defending herself against emotional cruelty. Inspector Graves, listening to this account with the skepticism born of lengthy experience with human testimony, found himself confronted with a new complication. Sarah's confession seemed to resolve the mystery of James's death, yet something about her account felt incomplete, as though crucial details remained unexplained. Most significantly, she could provide no adequate explanation for the candle that had been discovered on the porch, nor could she clarify how James's body had been transported from the lake to the manor's side entrance, a distance of perhaps 300 yards that would have required considerably more physical strength and deliberate planning than an impulsive act of violence seemed likely to involve. Miss Marple, upon learning of Sarah's confession through the village communication network, found herself returning yet again to the fundamental question that had troubled her from the beginning. Was the truth being obscured not by the absence of information, but rather by the presence of too many apparently conclusive pieces of evidence, each of which seemed designed to redirect attention away from what someone had deliberately orchestrated? Miss Marple's conviction that crucial elements of the truth remained obscured prompted her to undertake an action that was, for her, quite uncharacteristic in its directness. She requested a formal meeting with Inspector Graves at her cottage, a meeting she conducted with a sort of serious purpose that suggested she had arrived at conclusions of substantial significance. She began by acknowledging Sarah Blackwood's obvious distress and the genuine nature of her emotional turmoil. But she expressed her conviction, based on decades of observation of human behavior, that Sarah's confession, while containing elements of truth, did not constitute the complete explanation of James Courtney's death. She presented, with systematic clarity, a series of observations that had accumulated in her mind across the preceding days. The curious placement of the candle, which suggested deliberate staging rather than the hasty concealment that would naturally follow an impulsive act of violence. The cap discovered at the lake, which seemed incongruously positioned for an accidental loss during a struggle. The involvement of Catherine Marlowe at the manor during the critical afternoon hours, and, most significantly, the pattern of transportation and arrangement that suggested James's body had been deliberately moved and positioned on the porch with considerable deliberation and purpose. She then posed a question that seemed deceptively simple, but that carried profound implications. Had anyone made thorough inquiry into Eleanor Hartley's actual relationship with James Courtney beyond the professional connection suggested by her role as household housekeeper. Miss Marple explained that she had been troubled by Eleanor's evident anxiety during the police interviews, by the careful way in which she had answered questions without volunteering unnecessary information, and by the apparent anxiety she had displayed when questioned about James. Miss Marple had taken the liberty, she explained with characteristic delicacy, of making certain private inquiries through channels available to a woman of her age and village standing, and she had discovered something that seemed to have escaped the official investigation's attention entirely. Eleanor Hartley, approximately 18 years prior, had given birth to a son who had been raised by relatives in Scotland and who had, some 5 years ago, begun making inquiries about his birth mother's identity. These inquiries had eventually led the young man to discover that his mother was Eleanor Hartley, formerly employed at Thornfield Manor, and that his father was a man who had also been employed at the manor during the relevant period, a man named Thomas Hartley, Eleanor's former husband, who had subsequently abandoned both Eleanor and their son. The revelation took on additional significance when Inspector Graves made further inquiries and discovered that James Courtney had been present at Thornfield Manor approximately 5 years prior, during a school holiday from his London studies, at the precise time when this young man had begun his investigation into his parentage. Eleanor, it emerged, had confided in James during his previous visit, had explained her situation to the young man with some hope that he might sympathize with her difficult circumstances. James, however, had apparently responded with callous indifference, had dismissed her emotional distress as irrelevant to his own concerns, and had subsequently made certain remarks to Richard Ashford that had eventually led to Eleanor's position at the manor becoming decidedly uncomfortable. Eleanor had endured several additional years of employment under these strained circumstances before her recent departure, a departure that had been precipitated not by household tension between Richard and James, but rather by Eleanor's realization that she could no longer bear to remain in an environment where she was constantly reminded of the cruelty that James had displayed toward her during her moment of vulnerability. What emerged from these investigations was the startling revelation that Eleanor Hartley had recently been in contact with her son, who had developed considerably more robust opinions regarding the manner in which his mother had been treated than might be expected from a young man raised far from his place of origin. Eleanor's son, a man named David Hartley, aged 23, had travelled to England precisely during the period when James Courtney had returned to Thornfield Manor and had made inquiries throughout the village regarding James's presence and location. Multiple witnesses reported having observed a young man matching David's description loitering near the village lanes in the vicinity of Thornfield Manor during the afternoon of James's death, though no one had thought his presence particularly significant at the time. When Inspector Graves arranged for David Hartley to be brought in for questioning, the young man initially maintained his innocence, but when confronted with the accumulating evidence of his movements and presence, he eventually confessed to having encountered James on the grounds of Thornfield Manor during that fateful afternoon. David's account aligned in its essential details with Sarah Blackwood's confession regarding James's brutal treatment and his callous mockery of emotional vulnerability. David explained that he had intended merely to confront his mother's tormentor, to express his disapproval of the manner in which James had treated Eleanor, and to demand that James apologize for his past cruelty. However, James had responded with the same contemptuous dismissal that had characterized his interaction with Sarah, had ridiculed the notion that a young man raised by Scottish relatives should presume to judge him, and had made comments so deliberately wounding regarding Eleanor's circumstances that David had lost control of his emotions entirely. In a moment of overwhelming rage, David had struck James with a length of pipe he had found discarded near the lake, striking with sufficient force to cause the serious head injury that had resulted in death. David had then panicked, had attempted to assess whether James was still alive, and had subsequently discovered that James was indeed deceased. Confronted with this knowledge, and with Catherine Marlowe's presence in the manor creating complications that he could not immediately understand, David had made the impulsive decision to stage the scene in a manner that might cast suspicion upon Richard Ashford. He had carried James's body to the porch, had placed the candle as a deliberate signal designed to confuse the investigation, and had attempted to create the appearance of a crime motivated by financial dispute rather than personal outrage. The revelation of David Hartley's involvement in James Courtney's death brought a certain measure of closure to the official investigation, though it left in its wake considerably more complicated emotional and moral questions than the straightforward matter of criminal culpability. Inspector Graves, with the professionalism that characterized his approach to such matters, proceeded with the necessary legal formalities, though his demeanor suggested a man who recognized the profound tragedy underlying the crime, rather than viewing it as a simple matter of justice requiring swift punishment. David Hartley was charged with manslaughter rather than murder, a distinction that reflected the apparent absence of premeditation in the fatal blow, though the subsequent staging of the scene introduced complications that argued for more calculated deliberation than might initially appear. Richard Ashford was formally exonerated of all suspicion, a development that brought with it both relief and a certain air of residual unease, for the village had grown somewhat accustomed to regarding him as guilty and struggled to reorganize its collective understanding of events in light of his innocence. Sarah Blackwood, whose confession had inadvertently directed the investigation toward the truth despite containing only partial knowledge of the actual circumstances, was released without charges, though her role in the events preceding James's death ensured that she would carry the psychological weight of those moments indefinitely. She returned to her position at the tea shop with a quietness and subdued demeanor that suggested her brush with the machinery of criminal justice had permanently altered her understanding of herself and her place within the village community. The other residents of St. Mary Mead, who had spent the preceding days engaged in confident speculation regarding Richard Ashford's guilt, now found themselves forced to acknowledge the error of their assumptions and to confront the unsettling recognition that truth was considerably more complicated than their initial understanding had suggested. Eleanor Hartley, learning of her son's arrest and the circumstances that had prompted his actions, experienced a complexity of emotion that seemed to strain the boundaries of what any single human heart could adequately contain. Grief for James's death, recognition of her own role in creating the circumstances that had led to the tragedy, profound sorrow regarding her son's fate, and a complicated gratitude that he had acted out of love for her, however misdirected that love had proven to be. It was at this juncture that Miss Marple requested a private audience with Inspector Graves, an audience that took place in the inspector's temporary office at the police station rather than at her cottage. She came bearing no new evidence or startling revelations, but rather seeking to discuss with Graves certain aspects of his investigation that she felt warranted reflection and consideration beyond the immediate matter of determining culpability. She began by commending the inspector's professionalism and his eventual willingness to pursue lines of inquiry that extended beyond the superficially obvious. But she expressed her conviction that the investigation's conclusions, while legally and factually accurate, risked obscuring the deeper human truths that had motivated the crime. She spoke, with quiet eloquence, about the manner in which societies constructed narratives of guilt and innocence without always taking adequate account of the circumstances and emotional conditions that motivated human behavior. She noted that James Courtney had been a young man whose actions suggested a profound emptiness of character, a capacity for cruelty that seemed almost pathological in its casual dismissal of others' suffering, yet whose death was now being treated as an unfortunate but straightforward matter of legal consequence rather than as a tragedy rooted in the failure of multiple people and institutions to exercise compassion and restraint. Inspector Graves, listening to Miss Marple's reflections with the respect that her evident wisdom commanded, found himself reconsidering aspects of the case that the legal framework within which he operated did not adequately address. He acknowledged her observation that David Hartley's actions, while constituting a crime in the legal sense, were rooted in a complexity of circumstance and emotion that simplified explanations failed to capture. He noted that Eleanor Hartley had been systematically treated with contempt by a man who had possessed the power to wound her without consequence, and that this systemic cruelty had ultimately resulted in the tragedy that had now engulfed her son. He reflected upon the manner in which Catherine Marlowe's presence at Thornfield Manor had introduced complications that had temporarily obscured rather than clarified the investigation's direction, and how the accumulation of partial truths and incomplete understandings had gradually assembled themselves into a picture considerably more intricate than anyone had initially anticipated. What emerged from this conversation was a mutual recognition that the investigation's conclusion, while legally satisfactory, represented only a partial understanding of the events that had culminated in James Courtney's death on that October afternoon. Miss Marple spoke of the manner in which small communities such as St. Mary Mead were frequently characterized by hidden currents of resentment, unacknowledged cruelty, and carefully concealed emotional damage that accumulated across years until some precipitating event transformed latent tensions into manifest violence. She suggested that the village's rapid assumption of Richard Ashford's guilt had reflected not merely a logical conclusion based on available evidence, but rather a deep psychological need to locate evil in a familiar figure, rather than confront the possibility that such darkness might reside in unexpected places or emerge from circumstances that seemed to justify violent response. She noted that the investigation had ultimately revealed not a simple murder, but rather a tragedy rooted in multiple failures of compassion, restraint, and human understanding that spanned years and involved numerous participants in a drama that none of them had consciously orchestrated. Inspector Graves departed St. Mary Mead within the week. His official business concluded, though Miss Marple noted in his final interaction with her certain thoughtfulness that suggested her observations had achieved their intended effect. He had come to understand, she believed, that the investigation's conclusion represented not so much the discovery of truth as the identification of facts sufficient to satisfy legal requirements, while necessarily obscuring deeper truths regarding human motivation and moral culpability that extended far beyond the scope of criminal justice. Miss Marple returned to her cottage and to her knitting, settling once more into the rhythms and routines that had defined her existence for decades, carrying within her the accumulated understanding of human nature that she would continue to employ in service of justice, though a justice considerably more subtle and complicated than that administered by courts and legal proceedings. The autumn turned gradually into winter, and St. Mary Mead began its slow retreat into the quieter rhythms that characterized the season. The leaves that had covered the lanes in October were swept away by November winds, and the bare branches of the village's ancient trees became silhouettes against gray skies that seemed to promise snow, though rarely delivering it. Life in the village gradually returned to its ordinary patterns, though the events surrounding James Courtney's death had left an indelible mark upon the community's collective consciousness. Thornfield Manor stood partially shuttered, awaiting the resolution of legal matters pertaining to Richard Ashford's inheritance and the disposition of the estate. Richard himself had withdrawn from public view, taking residence temporarily in London with Catherine Marlowe, a development that occasioned considerable speculation regarding the future of their relationship and the manner in which scandal might or might not be weathered by a man of his standing. The preliminary hearing regarding David Hartley had been conducted with the sort of procedural gravity that suggested the court system taking seriously the legal complexities introduced by the combination of impulsive violence and deliberate concealment. Yet what occupied Miss Marple's thoughts during these quiet winter weeks was not the legal disposition of the case, but rather the broader implications of what had been revealed about the nature of the community in which she had spent so many years. She found herself reflecting, with a sadness that seemed to deepen as she considered the matter more thoroughly, upon the manner in which human cruelty frequently proceeded from small beginnings a dismissive comment, a contemptuous glance, a refusal to acknowledge another person's suffering as worthy of recognition or compassion. James Courtney had been a young man shaped by advantages of wealth and education, advantages that had apparently generated in him a conviction that he stood fundamentally apart from and above ordinary human beings, that their vulnerabilities and emotional needs were matters of insignificance compared to his own comfort and amusement. Eleanor Hartley had encountered this cruelty in its most personal form, had absorbed the wound of having her deepest pain met with mockery, and had carried that wound silently for years while raising a son who eventually transformed his mother's suffering into action that resulted in death. What troubled Miss Marple most profoundly was the recognition that justice, in its legal form, seemed inadequate to the true dimensions of the tragedy. David Hartley would face trial and would likely receive a sentence that imprisoned him for a number of years, his life disrupted and constrained as consequence for an action that, while legally constituting a crime, had emerged from a comprehensible human response to systematic cruelty. James Courtney, despite his character flaws, had lost his life before he had opportunity to develop the wisdom that might have transformed his understanding of other people and their inherent dignity. Eleanor Hartley would live with the knowledge that her son had acted violently in her defense and would carry the consequences of that action indefinitely. Richard Ashford had been temporarily implicated in a crime he did not commit, his reputation tarnished by association with circumstances beyond his control. Sarah Blackwood had experienced the humiliation of confession and interrogation while bearing no actual culpability for the fatal blow. The candle on the empty porch had served its purpose as a marker of confusion and misdirection, and now it remained merely an object, divested of the meaning that had briefly invested it with significance. On a grey afternoon in late November, as Miss Marple sat in her window seat completing the grey cardigan that had been her project throughout the duration of the investigation, she received an unexpected visitor. Eleanor Hartley, having obtained Miss Marple's address through village channels, presented herself at the cottage door with an air of hesitant purpose that suggested she had resolved to undertake this visit despite considerable internal resistance. Miss Marple received her with the warmth and acceptance that characterized her treatment of all village visitors, and invited Eleanor to sit by the fire and take tea. The conversation that ensued was conducted with a delicacy that allowed for emotional expression while maintaining the boundaries of propriety that governed social interaction in the village. Eleanor spoke of her gratitude for Miss Marple's role in ensuring that the truth had ultimately emerged, though she acknowledged that the truth, while legally clarifying, had brought little comfort to anyone involved in its revelation. She expressed her profound sorrow regarding the circumstances that had motivated her son's actions and her recognition that she bore some responsibility for creating the emotional conditions that had led him to believe that violent defense of his mother's dignity was an appropriate response to James's cruelty. What Eleanor had not anticipated, she explained, was the manner in which Miss Marple's investigation had illuminated not merely the facts of the crime, but also the accumulated patterns of human interaction that had preceded it. She had come, she indicated somewhat haltingly, to ask Miss Marple whether she believed that forgiveness, either of her son for his actions or of herself for her role in creating the circumstances that had led to tragedy, was a possibility worthy of pursuit. Miss Marple, responding with the wisdom born of decades spent observing human nature in all its complexity, suggested that forgiveness was not something that could be accomplished through force of will or determined intention, but rather emerged gradually as people learned to view their own actions and the actions of others with compassion rather than judgment. She spoke of the manner in which communities healed, not through swift legal determination, but through the slow work of understanding, through the gradual recognition that most human beings acted from comprehensible motives rooted in circumstance and limitation rather than from fundamental evil. She suggested that Eleanor's task would be to bear witness to her son's experience, to support him through the legal proceedings that lay ahead, and to maintain faith in the possibility of redemption that existed even within the most painful circumstances. As Eleanor departed from the cottage late in the afternoon, having spent nearly 2 hours in conversation that ranged across topics both specific and philosophical, Miss Marple watched her go with an expression of profound gentleness. She returned to her knitting, completing the final rows of the cardigan with the same steady, meditative rhythm that had characterized the entire process. The work of justice, she reflected as her needles clicked in the gathering darkness, was never truly complete. Legal determinations provided structure and closure, but the deeper work of understanding human motivation and responding with appropriate compassion remained an ongoing process, one that communities undertook not through the machinery of courts and constables, but through the accumulated small acts of kindness, understanding, and patient observation that constituted the true fabric of village life. The candle on the empty porch had long since burned away, but its light had served ultimately to illuminate not merely the facts of a crime, but the profound complexity of the human heart in all its capacity for both cruelty and redemption. St. Mary Mead, like all communities, would move forward, carrying within its collective memory both the tragedy that had been revealed and the quiet wisdom of an elderly woman whose careful observation had ensured that truth, however complicated and sorrowful, would ultimately prevail over comfortable assumptions and convenient deceptions.